Hello, welcome everyone. We're getting started. Carolyn, do you want to close the door? So I know there's another event going on there. So welcome again. I'm Radhika Shah, co-president of Stanford Angels and Entrepreneurs. And we're getting started, so I'd like to request we stop conversations so everyone can hear. Caroline, can we get some help on that? Yeah. So excuse me, sorry to disturb you, but let's get started, just because we have a tight schedule here. So I'm Radhika Shah, co-president of Stanford Angels and Entrepreneurs. It's a 1,200-member community at Stanford, tech innovation, investment, entrepreneurship. I'm excited to welcome you all today here on behalf of CARE, Stanford Angels and Entrepreneurs, as well as the Handa Center for Human Rights. Really, really thank you all for taking the time to join us in your busy lives. And we have an exciting panel here, and we're going to hear from CARE's leadership, the exciting Michelle Nunn, who we are all huge fans of, and Mark, also from CARE. And we were going to have Professor David Cohen from the Handa Center, but he's down with a bad bug. So instead, we have Søren Jorgensen, who is also from the Handa Center, a fellow there, and also ex-Consul General of Denmark for Silicon Valley. So we should have an exciting conversation, and we have some amazing people in the room. We're looking forward to hearing your thoughts as well. But before starting, I just wanted to acknowledge that we have some amazing, inspiring people with us today. We're honored to have Gerard Casper, ex-president of Stanford, with us in the room today, and thank you for joining us. And Gerard is a huge supporter of CARE, and I just learned that he was a CARE package recipient as a child in Hamburg, Germany. So thank you for joining us. We're very honored. And I also want to start by thanking, in the back of the room, Ali Alejandra, who is the executive director for CARE here on the West Coast, and Caroline, who's director of development. And they done all the hard work to get this event started and organized. So thank you so much. Without you, there won't be this event. And with that, wanted to start by introducing our panelists. And Michelle, of course, all of you know, she's the CEO of CARE USA. She has been in very key roles in civil service, in kind of for Senate seat she was running for. And she has been CEO of very, very inspiring NGOs. And she's bringing some amazing new initiatives to CARE, I believe, to touch the lives of 200 million people. And we'll be hearing about those. We have Søren, whom I mentioned earlier. Søren is a fellow at the Handa Center for Human Rights. He's an academic, so he will attempt to bring the academic's perspective instead of David Cohen. He was the CEO of the Tech Innovation Center for Denmark and has been a diplomat for a while, but also an academic around law and technology, so he'll bring some tech perspectives as well. And we have Mark, whom I haven't met, so I'm trying to say your name right, last name right, Mark. Mark Muckerheide, CEO of CARE Social Ventures, who has been in the retail space at Target as the director of CSR and sustainability. He has founded various profitable initiatives, including the Global Poverty Advisors, a consulting firm engaging with impact investors and international development nonprofits. So we have a very complimentary set of speakers here. But before we start hearing the panel's perspectives, I just wanted to take a moment to say that it's an exciting moment. We are 3 years into the Sustainable Development Goals. As most of you know, about 3 years ago, almost all world leaders came together at the UN and ratified one of the most ambitious set of goals ever, the 17 Sustainable Development Goals. These goals recognize that development around education, healthcare, poverty alleviation, climate change is deeply interlinked. They weave together environmental, social, and economic goals. And they recognize it's important not to leave anyone behind. And these goals have been a rallying cry for all world citizens to come together. And within these goals, goal number 1 is eliminate poverty. And that is a goal we're going to focus on today, to me, it is the mother SDG of them all, because it is so deeply interlinked to every other goal, and it is complex and it's nuanced. And if we can tackle that, we can tackle everything. And yet it's non-trivial, and so excited to have CARE here. CARE is one of the organizations having a huge impact in alleviating poverty and working on it on many different fronts. And the other topic we'll touch on is what are some of the non-standard ways in which we can advance the SDGs, particularly SDG 1. And one of them is technology. It's again a moment when many of us are debating, is technology doing more harm or more good in advancing the SDGs? It's a powerful lever of change. Is this going to be the oil of the new economy, or is it going to be the downfall? And is it going to make inequality worse and create yet a new form of divide between the haves and the have-nots? And we'll hear perspectives on that as well. And also, sitting right here in Silicon Valley, we sometimes get carried away and think that technology is the only tool for innovation. There's many more. Innovation in finance, innovation in how we structure things, as well as many other dimensions. So we'll hear diverse perspectives. And we have people from around the world, so it's exciting. So with that, without further ado, I wanted to invite Michelle to share some perspectives. Tell us a bit about CARE. How big is CARE? What are your priorities? How do you set them? What does CARE do?
Okay. And keep it short, right? So I think we started with an introduction of Gerhard, and it's appropriate to invoke, I think, the history of CARE when you think about our current moment. As Gerhard's one of the original CARE package recipients in Germany, and so CARE was started by a group of change agents, innovators who said we're not going to stand on the sideline, invented the idea of a CARE package, and within 4 months of actually coming together, delivered 20,000 packages to Le Havre, France, and thereafter delivered 100 million packages. So when I think about innovation and I think about technology, I think, like, how did they figure out how to deliver hundreds of thousands of CARE packages to a devastated post-World War II? I mean, pre-Amazon, pre-actual, like, the postal services working at that point. And, I mean, and then you think about the boldness and audacity, even from a moral perspective, to not stand on the sideline, but also to be sending packages to our former enemies. And so I take a lot of heart from that legacy. And if you fast forward, CARE doesn't send CARE packages anymore, but we are focused on alleviating and overcoming and defeating poverty. And so we operate in 95 different countries. We have over 900 different projects around the world. We are reaching anywhere from 60 to 80 million people every single year. And what we've realized along the path of the last 75 years is that we don't believe that we can achieve the first SDG without achieving the fifth SDG around gender equality. And so we have a real focus on women and girls and on gender justice. And so that's a little bit about CARE's work. And just in terms of scope, CARE US, our budget will be about $620 million this year. And a third of that is through private sector donations. And some of my favorite donors are the ones who said, I either received a CARE package or I was one of the Girl Scouts that put together the first CARE packages. And so that's an important, we continue to rely upon citizens and the private sector, along with government, to fuel our efforts.
Thank you, Michelle. My next question is for you, Mark. Is the construct of the NGO the right one to enact the change needed to make people's lives better? What are some new models, and what is some of the innovation happening at CARE around this to leverage market dynamics?
I'd say that I think it still is a relevant model. I don't think it can be the model. So what we know is the UN has estimated that we need about $1.5 trillion a year to achieve the SDGs. And there's $150 billion a year in aid. So you can quickly do the math and say there's just simply not enough money to get to where we want to go with the money that we have. And so fortunately, I think there's a lot of market-based approaches that have sprung up, right? And so both from the move of mainstream corporations and businesses trying to figure out how they change their brands and their work to have a social impact, to the rise of lots of brain power and lots more folks thinking about how they create a social enterprise or a business that's going to do something good and have it pay for itself. I think the role where NGOs can play is, and CARE is a great example of them, and I found this in my consulting work working with lots of other NGOs, is most nonprofits' portfolios, I would say on average, have somewhere about 10 to 15 to 20% of the work that they do that can be converted over into financially sustainable entities. So they're just things that nonprofits have been doing for a long time, doing it the way they've been doing, and I think the more that we can bring business options to them and help them do those conversions, that's ideal. So that's what CARE Social Ventures is there to do for CARE, is it helps programs assess whether they could become social enterprises, and the ones that can be, it helps them convert into social enterprises so that they no longer need philanthropy to continue to have those impacts.
Thank you, Mark. Søren, the next question for you. What do you see as the role of human rights, the rule of law, and kind of tackling corruption to help advance poverty, or rather poverty alleviation?
Mm-hmm.
And also tell us a bit about what is the systems change needed in mindsets to achieve this goal, to achieve SDG 1?
Yes, thank you. And that's an extremely important question, and I would like to go back to sort of what you said initially about sort of the interrelation between the various SDG targets and the circumstances around the SDG targets. There's no doubt that the world is ill. We all know that the temperature is raised and we are suffering from global warming, but there are other ailments as well. The UN Secretary General last year pointed to a global trust deficit disorder, but we are also suffering from an SDG implementation fatigue and a human rights implementation gap. And if you put these together, there's actually a pretty strong basis for sort of using the human rights agenda also in relation to the SDG agenda. That's natural, of course, because they are interrelated, and you might say you don't have development in the SDGs, including in SDG 1 and in poverty, if you don't have sort of stable conditions to do it, and if you don't have an environment that's conducive to do development. And that is an environment that is based on human rights and the rule of law and good and functioning government institutions and a non-corrupt environment. And there's even sort of data, and I think data in Silicon Valley is always good. There's data to support that, because if you run through the SDGs and the human rights agenda, you'll discover that 92% of the actual SDG targets are directly interlinked or related to human rights. So if you move on the human rights agenda, you are actually moving directly in favor of 92% of the SDG targets. The same goes if you look at the human rights recommendations of the human rights organizations. You have more than 110,000 direct recommendations on human rights actions. And 60% of those recommendations, that's a figure that was developed by the Danish Institute for Human Rights, 60% of those recommendations also relate directly to the SDG targets, including the SDG target number 1 of poverty alleviation.
Thank you, Søren. Another question for you, Michelle. Share a story from the field at CARE and around innovation work. What keeps you doing this work? And what makes you hopeful in the wake of so many challenges, especially around SDG 1? Poverty is not a topic that makes you feel excited. There's so much sadness. What is it that keeps you going?
Yeah, well, I think it is the stories. I think it is the capacity to see how people meet the most difficult circumstances with extraordinary resiliency and hope and possibility. So I have a lot of favorite stories. I'll tell one because it's illustrative of some of the scaling work that we're thinking about doing at CARE, and maybe Mark can add to this. So when I was in West Africa, I met a woman whose name was Salamatu, and she was 13 when she was married against her will to a man who was over 60. And this was his third wife, actually. And by the time she was 20, she had 4 children. And she did not have the chance to go to school, literally talked about the fact that she would wear the same dress and have to wear it wet the day, because she had nothing else to wear. But she met a care staff person who introduced her to this idea of what we call our Village Savings and Loan Program. And it's a micro savings program, basically a very simple idea of women gathering together, 20 or 30 people on a weekly basis, saving a little bit of money and then lending it out to one another for small businesses. And she started a salt business with a couple of dollars and grew it, and Salamatu ends up having a real knack for business, and she becomes a very successful businesswoman. She's able to send her younger children to school. For those older children, she was able to buy one of them a car so that he could create a taxi service. She divorced her husband, remarried, and on top of that, she has started 200 plus village savings and loan programs involving thousands of people in Côte d'Ivoire. So, if you could imagine the power of one individual to create change, not only for herself and her family and her community, but also for literally thousands of other people. So, our idea is to take, for instance, the Village Savings and Loan Program that started 25 years ago with a small group in Niger that's now spread to Côte d'Ivoire with people like Salamatu, and to go from what's gone from 25 people to now 7 million people to 65 million people over the next 10 years. And we have a whole series of ways that we're going to think about scaling, which includes digital technology, it includes advocacy and public governmental partnerships and private sector partnerships. So that's a little bit about sort of a story of change, but how it also amplifies the possibility for scaled change for millions more people.
Thank you, Michelle. It's a very inspiring story. Mark, would you like to add a bit about what is CARE doing with technology, and what are some of the technology innovations that can help the SDGs?
Sure. So I think from a social enterprise standpoint particularly, everything we look at, we want to figure out how we can scale it, right? And technology is one of the ways that allows us to do that. And so I think each of the social enterprises, we try and figure out where can technology be something that speeds up our progress, allows it to be scalable beyond borders. So I think a good segue from the Village Savings and Loan groups is right now, CARE is about 50% of the worldwide microsavers. So there's about 15 million microsavers in the world, about 7 million of those are with CARE. So it's, the industry has grown, CARE is still a big piece of it, that's great to see. But there's still 600 million unbanked women in the world. So it's great to have 7 million savers, but then you look at the size of the problem and you say, okay, we've got to figure out how to scale this faster and better. And so some of that is partnering with governments, some of that's partnering with corporations, but some of that is the technology piece of it. So for example, we've created the group that runs these savings groups. We're headquartered in Tanzania, and so they created an application working with a lot of the women in these groups saying, what do you really need kind of to get to the next level in these groups? And they said, well, we need a couple things. One is we need to feel safer with our money. We can use help. We're doing a lot of hand calculations. We could use some help making sure that there's not fraud in the groups and that we feel confident where our money's going. And then we can't get checking and savings accounts. So one of the biggest ladders out of poverty is being able to connect to the formal financial sector. And when we show up to the Bank of Tanzania, for example, and we try and show up with our handwritten ledger from our savings group, the Bank of Tanzania says, well, that's nice, but we're not giving you a checking account. And so we've worked to create an application called Chimoka. And what it does essentially is I got to be in Tanzania a few weeks ago to see one of the very first groups. The group we went and saw was Education First. So it's a group about 25 women saving together. And they started using the application, and we watched a couple things happen. One is they were able to conduct their meeting in about 40 minutes instead of 2 hours because it was able to help do the calculations for them. They actually caught 3 missed payments from the group. And so, no judgment on how those happened from the women, but they said, oh, wait a minute, we're a couple missing. And 3 of the women said, oh yeah, I need to put that in, right? And so they got complete transactions and were able to check that. And then on the other side, we were able to work with the Bank of Tanzania, who said, it's not profitable for us to reach out to these women, right? And so now we said, Bank of Tanzania, what do you need to know? And they said, well, we just need these 3 pieces of information. Great, we'll put those in the app. So the Bank of Tanzania is now paying Chimoka to advertise and offer financial services to all the women. So they can choose whether they want to use it or not, right? But at least now they have access, and banks who want them as customers, especially when they've been wanting to be customers. And then in the virtuous circle of all of that, it should pay for itself. So as we have more advertisers on there, now we need to figure out how we make sure that we don't have downsides to that, right? And so that there's, because those can obviously happen. But as much as we can try and mitigate those, to have something that uses technology, pays for itself, and is scalable now globally to all the savers that we work with.
Thank you, Mark. That makes me think of also some solutions in India where technology is being leveraged to create livelihood for women. And it's been a game changer, such as Internet Sati and other areas. And yet, one part of me is thinking about, I'm very involved with the Rohingya project at the Handa Center along with Søren and others. And one of the worst humanitarian crises we have is the Rohingya situation, the refugee camps. And a big factor has been social media in that situation even happening. So technology can also do a lot of harm as well. And these people are living in such poor conditions. So for you, Søren, my question is, in addition to opportunities, how do you see the harm that technology does, and how can we avoid that, especially around the SDGs, but SDG 1 particularly, poverty?
I think the benefits are definitely there, and there are 2 benefits that I sort of would like to mention. But I think the harms are very much the risks of technology as we see them elsewhere. That is when data is not used appropriately, and that could be a problem for refugees or vulnerable groups in global situations. If data collected about them in order to do good is abused because it's not protected. So it's basically sort of the same privacy situation that you will have, and it's only geared because very often it will be extremely vulnerable groups, refugees in horrible situations where data about their sexual orientation or religious beliefs or other might put them in an additional risk. So there's sort of an additional layer of risk which is tremendously important. I think there are very many ways of managing that. One is, of course, that whoever manages development assistance or development programs or who works with development work with some of the sort of same models or of ethical guidelines that tech industry basically has to do in order to sort of protect data and ensure that we are actually employing data for good. I think actually there's an additional level to support that, and there I might sort of go for a Danish example. We've had traditionally had a very strong poverty orientation in Danish development aid. So that has been important. So the gender issue has been extremely important in that respect also. And sort of a recent initiative ties in tech more closely with what we do in the development area. And it might seem a little bit far-fetched, but I'll get to the point through our new tech ambassador, who's actually here in Silicon Valley. So we've nominated a person from the Danish Foreign Service to serve as an ambassador to the tech world. So that's a global role, and is very much about engaging tech in some of the global issues around tech in itself, but it's also to engage in discussions with the tech industry about other global challenges, including the development agenda and promoting the development agenda in relation to sort of tech and the opportunities and abilities that tech has to support good agendas. And the way we then connect that because that outpost is here in Silicon Valley, the way we connect it to the poverty-oriented development aid that we provide is through the development and the emergence of tech development which is our new initiative to promote the use of tech in development policies. So we are connecting all our ODA or development hubs, which are basically the Danish embassies globally in developing countries, in an effort to use tech more focused for development, and to do it also in dialogue with our tech ambassadors. So hopefully also doing it in a closer dialogue with the tech industry, to be able to promote the use of tech for development, but also to be able to do that in a way that is not harmful, but is actually supportive of actual development and the SDG goals in general.
Thank you, Søren. It's been very inspiring these difficult times to hear the Danish story of how you guys think of society and the world. And that leads me, coming back home, a question for you, Michelle. As the number, size, and scope of complexity of humanitarian crises around the world grows, the situation in our own country, in DC, poses threats and challenges that many of us are concerned about. Could you comment on that? Is CARE doing anything on that front?
Let me just say one word about the technology, because I know we're speaking to a group of people that have an enormous capacity to help around innovation, to bring technology for good in the world. I think it's important to think about the spectrum of technology, and I'll just be confessional here. You know, Wilbur and I were talking about artificial intelligence and how to apply that in humanitarian contexts. But CARE spends a good bit of time thinking about, like, how do we ensure that our country offices have access to internet in South Sudan, and how are they going to upload their financials onto our PeopleSoft platform, and if they miss that by 3 weeks because there's no internet, so just like the very prosaic pieces. The second piece of that, to data security. So in the last year, CARE's had 2 phishing attacks. You wouldn't think that we're like a huge target, but we also, here we are, a big organization, but we don't have a huge amount of money to spend on cybersecurity. And how do we protect our donors? But more importantly, how do we protect those people whose information, for instance, in Jordan, we work with literally tens of thousands of refugees. We're collecting psychosocial support information about them. So I think there is this kind of challenge for how do we be aspirational about the opportunities that technology presents, but also how do we ground ourselves in the realities of how nonprofits can really embrace the core capacity and foundational elements of technological efficiency. So back to your question on the humanitarian front. So there are CARE is faced now with multiple what we call I won't go into the typology of humanitarian crises, but just know enormous crises. If you think about Yemen or Syria or South Sudan, most of them are what would call slow onset crises. They're not Haiti earthquake, where you're generating millions of people who are supporting those and saying we want to do something, and necessarily where we're even meeting a small portion of the UN required humanitarian threshold of investment that's required. So we have multiple crises, insufficient resources. We have a US government that, for the first time in 75 years, since, for instance, in CARE's history, is really saying we're questioning the very mantle of American humanitarian leadership in the world. Not just questioning it, but actually working against it in a variety of ways and speaking against it in a variety of ways, including the threat of and budgets that cut humanitarian aid by 30 to 70%. And so it's a very difficult moment. But just, I guess on the positive side, there has been bipartisan congressional support that has sustained international aid and foreign assistance at the same threshold for the last couple of years. So I think we can take heart in that. Very strong bipartisan support. And just a little story about advocacy and the importance of citizen engagement. when Trump was elected, and within a few months, I think it became clear that humanitarian crises were not going to be a mantle of leadership for him going forward in the world. And so a small group, a couple of CARE staffers said this was a moment in which we had multiple countries that were facing potential famine. In multiple countries simultaneously, and CARE staff, and there aren't many times where you can claim an advocacy victory so directly, but a couple of young CARE staff members, and I will say take no credit for this because I thought, oh, this is not going to work, but go ahead and try, worked quietly with congressional staff members, and for the first time ever from Congress, $1 billion allocation for humanitarian aid was made towards those multiple famine-threatened countries. It was under the radar, not something that it was purposefully under the radar, but there is an opportunity for us to exert advocacy, sort of both pressure and inspiration and creativity to apply to this moment, and I think it's called for more than ever.
Thank you, Michelle. There's also, I wanted to mention that another hat I wear is I'm an advisor to the SDG Philanthropy Platform. It's a catalytic platform started by UNDP, the Ford Foundation, Hilton Foundation, and the Rockefeller Philanthropy Advisors. And the SDG framework really helps bring foundations philanthropists together in now 9 countries where it's launched to kind of fill this gap that has been recently created. And while touching on philanthropy, I must acknowledge my mentor and one of the thought leaders in philanthropy in Silicon Valley, sitting in the back of the room, Steve Tobin, who is the president of the Flora Family Foundation. Does wonderful work funding some of the really game-changing organizations, who've gone on and brought huge change in the world in women's empowerment as well as alleviating poverty. Thank you, Steve, for everything you do. And with that, we'll come back with a question for the panelists, but with the amazing people in the room, academics, philanthropists, social entrepreneurs, now we'll open up for questions or comments from the participants here for the panelists. And I'd like to request, because we have so many of you will like as many voices as possible, so keep the comments, questions brief if possible. And we'll take 3 at a time, just so that we can get as many voices. Anyone would like to get started? And do we need to share a mic, or can we hear clearly, Carolyn? Yeah? Okay. Any questions, comments, remarks? We welcome your participation. And please introduce yourself as well. I know there's awesome people here.
My name is Tracy Kornick. I'm a Stanford alum, but long-term supporter of CARE. Not at big levels, but...
No, big levels, important levels.
My question, just as it relates to the topics that have been brought up, I'm actually kind of curious in terms of, I know there's the Scale by Design event happening tomorrow, and it seems like there's a lot of tie-ins to the areas that have come up in questions today, and I'm just wondering, just hoping to hear a few comments in terms of how Scale by Design fits in terms of the desire to expand and really leverage the philanthropy efforts that CARE has been leading.
Can you quickly just summarize the question?
Yeah, and do we need the microphone, do you think? Maybe, yeah, okay. So the question was around a program that CARE has launched a couple of years ago called Scale by Design, and it was sort of how does that work, and maybe some of the models fit into some of this conversation. So just to give you a high level of some of the work that CARE is doing, and Dar Wave in the back is our Chief Innovation Officer who's here. When I came to CARE a couple of years ago, and this question of how do we scale and how do we reach the SDG goals, because we are going to have to do things differently. And so we started a variety of different kind of a portfolio of innovation agenda ideas. One of them was something called Scale by Design, taking the accelerator model of the private sector and applying it to projects. We learned that at CARE, for instance, the VSLA program that we talked about started in Niger. It grew kind of organically, but we didn't have necessarily an intentional way of taking small programs and growing them to millions of people. How do you go across geographies? How do you scale through advocacy? How do you scale through market-based approaches? So the Scale by Design is a program that takes teams at CARE that think that they can scale to over 1 million people and puts them through a 1-year accelerator program. And so tomorrow night, we're going to be doing a kind of a pitch night where 5 of our teams are going to come together and talk about their innovations. Actually, a couple of them are talking about technology innovation and how they're using that for financial inclusion for women in Peru, as an example. But that Scale by Design is sort of a pipeline towards scale and a really intentional way of creating that. We're hoping then that some of those ventures or ideas or programs will go to Mark's work around CARE Social Ventures. So social enterprise, have a real incubator for CARE Social Enterprise. And then Virginia, who is here with CARE as well, is one of the leaders of something that is a new model for CARE as well, which is an impact investing fund called CARE Enterprises. Focused with a gender justice, which Virginia has a really great way of saying it, like a proprietary gender justice lens. And it's really applying a rigorous way of thinking about how do we empower women through our investments in social enterprise. So launching a $50 million fund that we're moving forward. So that's sort of a spectrum of some of the innovation work that CARE's doing, and we'd love to have people come out and hear the pitch night tomorrow.
Where is it?
Who can help me? Where is it? Salesforce. Salesforce at what time? 6 p.m. Salesforce. Great.
We'll send around follow-up details with information.
Okay. Any other questions, comments? Kevin, yeah? Why don't you give him the mic? Yeah. I think
Great.
So you didn't get a mic. That's pretty impressive. Obviously, I'm
Kevin,
soft
introduce
spoken.
yourself and briefly the DCI program, because we have amazing people from the program here.
Okay, thank you. I'm Kevin Selwyn. I am an alum of the Stanford Distinguished Careers Institute, DCI, and I moved out here from Atlanta, CARE's headquarters, in early 16 to do the program. But what I'm interested in is, as you talk about scaling, I think oftentimes about the enormous amounts of wasted money that have been tossed into the developing world through ineffective programming over the past half century. And technology obviously gives you a new leg toward creating something that you can measure, that you can compare with control groups, et cetera, et cetera. Can you talk a little bit about what you're doing in that area?
I can talk a little bit about that from a social enterprise standpoint. So I think our model is meant to be a lean startup model. When I came in, so I had been at Target for about 20 years and then had done consulting work and social enterprise work, and then came over to CARE about a year ago. And part of what I wanted to do is I started looking at the social enterprises that had happened. And there's some examples where, a couple corporations got together and said, we should do something. So let's write some big CSR checks and here, CARE, go implement this thing, right? And I'm looking at these programs that had, $2 to $4 million checks to start with. And so, of course, they have these big budgets. And then they realize that the way it's been run or the way it's been done isn't sustainable. And it's like, oh, wait a minute, we need to keep money coming in the door or figure that out. So we've said, let's use a stage gate approach. Let's have our first few versions be minimum viable product versions. Let's figure out how we get stuff to a place where we can see that it's going to be scalable or it's going to be profitable in the future. And once we get through those first few stages and we see it sticky enough and we see that the model is going to work, then we can go out and raise all the capital we can find to grow it as fast as possible. But for example, in our case, we've got 5 stages that they have to graduate through, and they've got to get through our 3rd stage And by that point, they've tested it, they've prototyped it, they've been in the market, they've showed that, they've proved that it will be profitable at scale, or given us enough proof that we feel confident in that. And only then do we allow them to scale as fast as they'd like, or as fast as we can raise capital. But until then, we've actually got ceilings on the amount of philanthropic capital we'll allow in those seed stages, so that they're not taking up, frankly, too many resources of what is a very scarce resource globally.
I mean, I would just add that I think CARE and all nonprofits are looking for the holy grail of how to quantify, how to use data to ensure that we are effective and efficient, looking at our return on investment. It is both incredibly important and difficult. And I just had a 2-hour presentation this morning, starting at 7 a.m., to look at our collective impact numbers and how are we doing towards our 200 million impact, and how are we measuring the different dimensions of our sexual and reproductive health work, women's economic empowerment work. How do you compare how many dollars are invested in girls' education to the quality of health care provided around maternal health? These are complex issues, but I do think technology, real-time capacity for information is newer for all of us, and the opportunity therein, in addition to the data analytics, provides a really important opportunity for greater efficiency and ensuring that we are truly galvanizing around impact that's meaningful.
If I were to add anything to that, because I agree, technology and the use of and the intelligent use of data is the place to start. But then there's actually a very strong base of evaluation of projects already done through many years. So be extremely good and extremely thorough at evaluating the effects of what you do, and use that data, because that is tremendously important. And then finally, be extremely collaborative. There are learnings on the data and on the developments that we have made and that others have made, also in research and university environments, and in private sector or in private industry, and across borders. So being extremely collaborative towards sort of the research and the academic environment, and towards business and internationally, in order to ensure the necessary and needed transparency around what actually works would be what I would add.
I wanted to also bring in one more dimension here. This is such an important question. And I've been impressed seeing what SIGA, the Center for Effective Global Action at Berkeley, and IPA, whom I met via Steve, they're bringing the randomized controlled trials methodology that's used in the medical space to evaluate the per dollar cost effectiveness of innovations, bringing in the economic lens. And that is, again, very interesting work with the economics lens. Steve, is there something you want to add on that one, around how IPA is doing this?
Well, IPA is providing turnkey support to researchers all over the world who want to come in and determine whether it's better to sell dead nets to the poor to prevent malaria, or give them away for free. That's a testable proposition, and it can be done through randomized trials. And why you get the end of a debate once that work is done. So that kind of methodology is really critically important to advancing on this agenda, and getting beyond some of these questions about whether we're throwing money away or just not applying enough resource in a more concerted fashion. So it's an exciting part of the anti-poverty agenda to know that there are groups like SIGA and IPA and JPAL and my team that are really quite disciplined about not only answering research questions, but developing a research agenda in concert with policymakers, because the policy establishment needs to be in harness so that they have a stake in what questions are being asked and what evidence is then translated back into scalable policy.
Thank you, thanks. Any other questions, comments? In the back there.
Hi, Søren, also from CARE. Just a comment to add. I think the question about waste is a really great one. And it begs the question also of where solutions come from. Representative Diana Presley has a great quote around those closest to the pain should be closest to the power. And so the idea of also centering people that are affected by marginalization and poverty at the heart of the creation of solutions, we see in every sector creates much more leaner, better, more effective. The texture, I mean, that's kind of a lesson of human-centered design in some ways, right? Being able to learn how to listen, creating processes to co-design, et cetera. So I just wanted to add that to the conversation.
Dar, do you want to just talk about how some of the work that we're doing might fit that model?
Yeah, and in some ways it's, I think, the cut through, or it's one of the reasons that I came to work for CARE 2 years ago. You know, when we talk about the value of local context, 95% of our 10,000 staff members are from the places that they work. So, you know, we really walk the walk in terms of understanding the local context and how we can listen to that, turn that into solutions and fund it. One example, we started an initiative called Embark, which is a collaborative funding circle focused on gender justice solutions. And what's unique about that is working with feminist social movements around the world to be able to say, how do we design a project for scale by design? So we're looking at the advocacy levers, the tech levers, you know, the doors that we as a global network and confederation can open from day one, rather than as something that's only kind of built in at the end. So that's just one example, but yeah, thanks.
Thank you. I think we had a question here somewhere.
My name is Rekha Singhal. I'm from School of Engineering. I think I'm the odd one out because I'm a researcher, technology researcher. So my question is so the reason I'm here is because I'm looking, so most of our research is driven by business, right? And then social sector looks at how do we apply those now, technology in our sphere, and if we face challenges. So what are the key technology innovation you will look for which are driven by social innovation? You know, so that it's for the researcher to look at innovation, technology innovation from the social people point of view rather than the business point of view, so that it becomes easy to apply. So I really need to know few of the key challenges from you guys, which researchers should look for to do something in that area.
Yeah, I guess my comment would be anywhere where subsidization should be part of the equation, right? So I think where there can be a commercial lens to it, obviously the private sector is going to be the place to advance that. But there are problems that require some subsidization, either in the beginning or throughout them. And anywhere where that is the case, I think an NGO partner who's willing to learn and innovate are going to be the folks to partner with in that sense.
Co-creation with NGOs or social partners would be the key to sort of develop solutions around or involving the technology. I can think of a few examples. I just a few weeks ago had meetings with an NGO from Tunisia around that, with a very strong sort of civil society engagement. Part of that was actually the Scouts movement in Tunisia. They had a very dispersed network and were sort of very close to many of the issues that they were dealing with, but a very relevant partner in co-creating or development relevant solutions for that.
Mark, I was going to call on you to add. Mark has been doing the work of some of our technology innovation and some of the work in Egypt now, so I thought you might.
Sure. We're working on a lot of really exciting things around technology and how we kind of mainstream those activities in our work in a lot of our country offices, and I've been fortunate to work with a number of our teams in those areas. And I can give a couple quick examples of some of the work that we're doing, some of which will be showcased tomorrow night at the Scale by Design pitch evening, but some other work that we're doing is, I guess, a bit more under the radar until it gets to the pitch night. So one example, I think a really exciting partnership that we have that we're going to be launching in Vietnam is a tri-party partnership with CARE as an organization, but partnering with 2 private sector partners in a really unique way. So we have a local social enterprise that is a Vietnamese TaskRabbit, so a way for people to post jobs and kind of connect them with workers, and then one of the largest banks in Vietnam. So the TaskRabbit type app is supporting migrant workers with job opportunities, employment opportunities, which is really great. The bank is coming in and saying, we have an e-wallet, And we want to look at ways that we can, safe ways for the women to be paid, but also ways for them to remit back home. In Vietnam, if you have, $20 that you want to send back to your family, you actually go to the local bus driver who drives out to that area and you give them the $20. The probability of that full $20 making it to the household is low. So we're looking at mobile wallets and mobile money as a way to kind of cut down on that. And then lastly, CARE is coming in two ways. We're coming in with a gender lens, looking at gender training to make sure that the women are empowered, that they understand their rights, and that they're receiving training on what those rights are when they're working with these companies. But also we're taking a look at the VSLA or savings group model that Michelle and Mark spoke about and saying, how can we do this in an urban context? A lot of where we do this is in rural areas where you have communities of individuals that know each other and known each other for a long time. How do we adapt that, get the same results, but do it in a more urban context with migrant workers? So that's a really exciting partnership that I think we're going to learn a lot out of that and see that as a model that we can scale in other contexts. But if you want any more examples, I'm more than happy to chat afterwards.
Well, maybe you all can talk. Yeah, sure. Yeah. Thanks.
Great.
Anyone else like to share anything or ask any questions? Yes. Yes.
Thank you. I happen to lead digital innovation for Wells Fargo, so I know a lot about what it takes to do innovation, and I'm really delighted to get to partner with CARE in launching the social enterprise that Mark mentioned to support their VSLAs, or Village Savings and Loan Organizations, we're launching right now in Tanzania. And so I just wanted to mention, well, first, network access. If you're an engineer and you can support rural network access, that's a huge area of technology focus that we need help on, generally globally. But secondly, I am so incredibly honored to partner with CARE because they have this model around investing in innovation that is unique in the humanitarian sector. This question around aid and waste in the venture capital, headquarters of the world here, I think we are incredibly tolerant of failure because we know that that's how you learn. We have that embedded into our DNA. Now, we measure that failure because of the ROI that it can bring in the long run to a portfolio investment, right? Like the financial return. But what we can measure in the humanitarian sector is what's happening out of the result of these village savings and loan organizations. The woman who made 50 cents a day and was living off of that, who's now making $10 a day because of a village savings and loan organization that she has access to. So I would just encourage everybody to think about the tolerance that we have for risk that we know we bring to this environment here uniquely in the Bay Area, and really bring that to the organizations that are facing the hardest challenges in the world and trying to solve those for people. Let's bring that same tolerance to risk for them as well.
Thank you. I also want to put someone on the spot, Zabre, Ms. Z, you're on the spot. Would you share a bit what's happening? We talked about we are in this place, we are in the heart of Silicon Valley where a lot of wealth is being created. And could you share some local perspective on California? And I just love the work you're doing. So.
Gosh, where to start that I can start and stop in about 40 seconds. I am working with a group of people in California. This is a California-focused project called the Economic Mobility Collaborative. And it started very informally a couple of years ago, actually, and it was a group of people, very intentionally multi-partisan in California, because the focus ultimately is on policymakers. And it was all people who worked, who dedicate their lives professionally to trying to make the state work better, but recognize that, I think this was a couple of years ago, and the Public Policy Institute of California had probably just come out with a report saying that about 46% of kids in California were living at or near the poverty line. In California, it's one of those statistics that you read and you think it must be a typo, and you rub your eyes and look again because it couldn't possibly be right. And so we were a part of a community of people who were smart, worked really hard, really passionate about making the world a better place, working really hard every day, but we still have, the trend lines are still all going the wrong way in a place like California. And so we got together to just say, we've got to try harder. Like, we're still not getting it. We're still missing something. What are we going to do? We've got to do better, because if we can't figure this out in a place like California, how can you hope to figure it out anywhere else? And that, the initial conversation was a one-off discussion, and it grew into something, and we're now, one of the partner who I started convening this group with has just been appointed to be Governor Newsom's chief economic and business advisor. Another one of our founding members has just been appointed to be his senior higher ed advisor, and so on. It's really, there's a moment in California, I think, to potentially break through and figure out what does the model look like. And in a political context, it's the difference between politicians, elected officials, working on these issues and trying hard to make a change forever, but the problem's still there. Shifting your mindset to, we are going to set a clear goal with a deadline, and we are going to achieve transformative change in 5 years, in 10 years. We're going to change this space. And I believe strongly, and a number of the people involved in this group do, Radhika's involved with this, believe that the only thing that's missing is deciding to do it. So that's where we are, and we're it's a very collaborative group, and a couple of lifetimes ago worked for the National Democratic Institute, was in Malawi, doing democracy and governance work. My background's in politics, and I think bringing this back to the conversation with CARE, I really felt when I came back to the US that it was strange how there just was not enough conversation between what was happening politically, domestically in terms of civic engagement, and internationally. There are so many lessons internationally that would so greatly enhance Americans' understanding of what was possible. And there were just all of these bridges that you could see in the air that weren't there yet, waiting to be built. And I think that probably also may be the case when it comes to economic opportunity and mobility.
Thank you. Thank you, Zabre. Unless we have other questions, yes.
Hi, I'm Lucian Chan with the Skull Foundation. I had two questions. One, as it relates to kind of innovations related to poverty alleviation, I was just curious the panel's perspective on direct cash transfers as a means to that. And then the second question was around, we talked a lot about the VSLAs and the scaling potential there, and I know a lot of the big INGOs have very similar types of programs. So to what extent are you collaborating or thinking about working with the other ones in terms of really scaling that model globally?
I can talk about especially unconditional cash transfers. So we are taking a look to try and figure out, should that be a benchmark, right? And so I think, Professor Niehaus and Give Directly, and we've been chatting with them and trying to figure out if you can't beat cash, right, then you should be handing out cash. So let's either prove that the intervention we're doing can beat it, and I think what I feel like in his words they've set out to do is try and figure out what's the hurdle that you should be able to clear, and we feel like we can clear that in a lot of places. But let's collaborate with them, let's work with them, let's figure out how we use that as a litmus test. I think that's another great way to figure out, evaluation. Bodies evaluation work, and JPOW and groups are great places to go dig in, use that evaluation work. But using unconditional cash transfers is another great, minimum benchmark to try and clear if you want philanthropy dollars going to that.
Yeah, I would just add, CARE's already giving out about $200 million plus each year in terms of cash transfers, especially around in the humanitarian context. So I think it is an increasing methodology that has the capacity also to disintermediate some of the broader structures and potentially create some reform mechanisms around that. One of the things that is tying it back into technology, CARE convened a group last year actually here in Silicon Valley with a group of other INGOs to talk about how we could create a interoperability around our cash transfer systems so that we could be able to share data. Speaking to how do we measure success, how do we ensure that we know what the patterns and lessons are. So I do think thinking through sort of how we do that going forward. And you had a second question about the VSLAs collaborating. So I think when Mark said, there are 14 million. We love that other organizations have adopted the VSLA model, and some of them actually call it a VSLAs. And I remember being in a country and visiting with the USAID who said, you should go talk to SAVE. They're doing this really cool thing called Village Savings and Loan Programs. I'm like, oh my God. But I think that's great, and part of our ambition to get to 65 million is partnerships with private sector and also with other NGOs and with governments and sort of market-based approaches through technology, et cetera. So it's really a combination. I mean, we think, and other organizations have adopted VSLA and they've added different kinds of interventions, and getting to the point of what works is what are the combination of ingredients that are essential for the highest level of impact, and how can we learn from one another?
Thank you. Søren, did you want to add anything, or?
Well, not to this specific question, but I do have a general comment, if that's okay. Or actually it's 3 very short comments, and they'll be very short.
We're almost at time, so if it's okay, I'll just we'll do final wrap-up comments if we could do them then. Yeah. And so I just wanted to quickly put the 2 academics in the room on the spot who are doing amazing work around kind of cross-disciplinary work around social innovation. And since we're tight on time, just a couple of lines, if we could hear your kind of thoughts, Gordon Bloom, Stuart Coultney in the back there. Can we quickly hear your kind of high-level thoughts on this before we wrap up, and then all of you do final comments?
So hi, so Gordon Bloom from Stanford. So I created a social entrepreneurship and innovation lab for global and planetary health. I started at Stanford about 20 years ago, and then moved my lab to Harvard. I just returned to Stanford. So anyway, I have many, many students who would be fascinated with all of these different opportunities. And I think that the key for me is to find the sweet spot between what's going on with technology change and really to marry that together with practical social innovation. So I find that a lot of these concepts really ultimately don't fly. And so I try to focus my students on things that I think are both, kind of, as I say, in that little intersection point. And often what gets ignored is the importance of the behavioral aspects of social innovation. So how do you understand how human behavior affects the success or the failure of some sort of social change model? So, and I love everything that Stuart's doing.
Yes, Stuart.
Am I the end or you the warm-up? I don't know. So I'm lucky enough to lead a program here called Design for Extreme Affordability. We take 40 students from around campus every year. We hook them up with partners around the world, so I totally agree with the idea that you've got to have partners on the ground to help you understand what's going on. And they divide up into teams of 4, and then they try to execute on challenges that we give them in the area of poverty alleviation. It's been going 16 years. We've worked with 57 partners in 32 countries, with 565 students so far, and we've just reached over 100 million lives touched by the products and services that result from the class. And so I would totally agree with Gordon in the case of it may be slightly against the conversation we're having this evening, understanding the human-centered issues first, and then deciding what a technology can actually do to help. And I would also add, and we walk the talk here, making sure that you're building and designing at the same time a sustainable business model, even if it's a donor-based or a subsidized-based model, understanding how your actual organization and how your actual project will sustain itself for the long term while you're designing the solution that goes with it.
Thank you, Stuart. And as we wrap up, I'd like to invite all our panelists to say some final thoughts, quick final thoughts. on this topic, starting with you, Mark.
Go for it.
Okay,
Go
well,
first, then, sure.
can I just echo the focus on humanity and humans in good technological development? I think that's tremendously important. Then the 3 points that I, and they're very, very brief, that I wanted to make. One, I just wanted to, because I realized that I didn't do that, sort of recognize CARE and underline the importance that we have had, or that we've attached to working with CARE and other organizations on the ground. But so acknowledging CARE. And the other was just echoing, because that's one of the things that I think are really important. You talked about the gender aspect and the importance of educating girls in relation to poverty alleviation. I think that the ratio is, if you educate 10% more girls in a country, that country will see a 3% GDP growth. I think that's still true. So that's an enormously important point in all of this. And my last point, very brief, and I won't name any company names, but I do have the solution to your connectivity issue. You mentioned the internet and the connectivity, which is extremely important for bringing advice, learning, education, what have you, out in the corners. There's a Danish company, and I won't say their name because this is not a commercial, who has a very, very mobile and flexible solution that's currently used in India and Africa and several other places, and it's actually a good option. So maybe you want the name afterwards.
I do. I want you to tell the name. Yes.
They're called Bluetown.
I love it when problems get solved on the panel.
Yeah.
Mark.
I guess mine will be more of an ask than a thought. Is just, I think that one of the big things that we need in the sector, I mentioned you've got commercial options, but figuring out how you take the work that's in subsidized work and converting it over into financially sustainable work. And in my vision, I'd love to see is, part of achieving the SDGs that we CARE leads in this work, but pushes the whole industry to really figure out where it takes big chunks of its work and makes that more financially sustainable. And there's a lot of people in this room with a lot of great experience and a lot of great connections. And so where any of you are interested in helping move that body of work in the industry forward, please come find me. I'm happy to chat. I would love to chat.
Yeah, I would just say that just looking out at this group, I think about the enormous intellectual capital and capacity for joining together to really achieve SDG 1, and I believe that we absolutely can do it, and I believe that it's not sort of a quixotic idea to defeat poverty. We really can defeat poverty, and you talked about the U.S. imperative. I do think it's incredibly important that we recognize, like, we've halved poverty in the last 20 years globally, while U.S. poverty has really remained largely the same. So I think there is real opportunity for us to learn from one another, and as you say, the interdependence and interconnections. But I guess just to reinforce Mark's invitation for we would love to have smart students. We would love to have the extraordinary wealth of knowledge and ideas, and look forward to the conversation and possibilities of partnership that's embedded in this room. And huge thanks to Radhika for convening us and for leading this and for your extraordinary work.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Michelle. And I want to thank all of you, thank the panelists. And I want to end with a quote from my role model, Mahatma Gandhi, who said, "Poverty is the worst form of violence," which I truly believe. And I also believe, like Michelle, we can absolutely overcome it. It doesn't need to exist, as long as we all come together and work on this, whether it be via tech innovation or human-focused tech innovation, design thinking, and as long as the organizations like CARE, which are so inspiring to kind of advance this tough goal, we can do it. And encourage all of you also to think, most of you are already doing this, but how can we all collaborate more deeply in making this happen? It's not going to be easy, even though we can do it, it will be complex. And whether you volunteer time, capital, or I do want to, as we mentioned Kevin, I was kind of blown away when I heard his family story. They moved from their home to a tiny home and gave away the bulk of their wealth, and the children got them to do it. So there are many different ways, but thank you again, and let's get rid of this extreme form of violence collectively. There's Carolyn reminds me there's more food, drinks, so stay for a bit, mingle, and let's connect and chat.